The baby's cry pierced the Kansas wind like a blade through Jonathan Miller's chest. Everyone in Red River Valley knew whose blood ran through those tiny veins, the same blood that had spilled his beloved Sarah's 3 months ago. The townspeople gathered in the dusty street, their eyes hungry for justice, waiting to see if grief would finally claim what remained of his humanity. But when Jonathan lifted the 11-month-old girl from the wooden crate, something ancient and inexplicable stirred within him. "She's mine," he whispered, and the words fell like thunder across the silent crowd. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Red River Valley when they brought her to him. Jonathan Miller stood on his porch, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail until his knuckles turned white as old bone. The delegation from town moved slowly up the dirt path, their faces grave beneath their wide-brimmed hats. Sheriff Coleman led them, carrying a wooden crate that seemed too small to contain anything of consequence, yet Jonathan knew it held the weight of his entire future. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain, and somewhere in that whisper he heard Sarah's voice calling his name. 3 months had passed since they'd found her body in the creek, her blue dress floating like a broken promise among the cattails. 3 months since Marcus Delacroix had fled into the night, leaving behind only the echo of gunshots and a wife heavy with child. The baby had been born in the county jail, delivered by the doctor's trembling hands while her father awaited the hangman's noose. Now Marcus was dead, justice served by rope and gravity, but his daughter remained, a living reminder of the man who had stolen Jonathan's world. The townspeople had debated her fate for weeks, their voices rising and falling like the tide of their collective conscience. As the delegation drew closer, Jonathan could see the baby's face peering over the edge of the crate. Her eyes were dark as river stones, wide with the innocent curiosity that belonged only to those who had never known the weight of sin. She couldn't have been more than 11 months old, her tiny fists reaching toward the sky as if trying to grasp something beyond her understanding. The sight of her sent a tremor through Jonathan's chest, a sensation he couldn't name, part rage, part sorrow, part something else entirely. He had expected to feel hatred when this moment came, had prepared himself for the cold satisfaction of turning away from his enemy's blood. Sheriff Coleman stopped at the base of the porch steps, his face etched with the kind of weariness that came from making impossible decisions. "Jonathan," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, "we've talked this through with the town council. Nobody wants to take her. The orphanage in Topeka is full, and the church ladies say—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't cut too deep. "They say it wouldn't be right, raising the child of the man who killed your Sarah. They think maybe you should decide what becomes of her." The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry, but something more plaintive, and Jonathan felt his heart skip like a stone across water. The other men shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping against the hard-packed earth. Jonathan recognized them all, farmers and shopkeepers who had known him since he'd first arrived in the valley 15 years ago with Sarah at his side. They had celebrated his wedding, mourned his childless years, and wept with him at Sarah's funeral. Now they watched him with a mixture of sympathy and expectation, waiting to see if grief had finally broken him completely. The baby reached toward Jonathan, her small fingers opening and closing like flower petals seeking sunlight, and in that gesture he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Time seemed to slow as Jonathan descended the porch steps, each footfall echoing like a heartbeat in the morning stillness. The men parted before him, their faces solemn as mourners at a graveside. When he reached the crate, he looked down into those dark eyes and felt the earth shift beneath his feet, not with the tremor of an earthquake, but with the quiet revolution of a soul choosing its own path. "She's mine," he said, the words emerging from some deep place he hadn't known existed. And as he lifted the baby into his arms, he felt the first crack in the wall of ice that had surrounded his heart since Sarah's death. The crowd that had gathered in the street stood frozen, as if carved from the same red clay that gave the valley its name. Jonathan held the baby against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through the thin cotton of her dress. She was lighter than he had expected, fragile as a bird's egg, yet somehow her presence filled the vast emptiness that had consumed him for months. The silence stretched between them all like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, pressed her handkerchief to her lips as if to hold back words that might damn them all. The baby's tiny hand found the collar of Jonathan's shirt and gripped it with surprising strength. "Jonathan," Sheriff Coleman said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to do this. Nobody would blame you if you walked away. After what her father did." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jonathan could feel the weight of their collective gaze, could sense the unspoken questions that buzzed between them like angry wasps. How could a man embrace the child of his wife's killer? What kind of justice was this? What would Sarah think if she could see him now? The baby made a soft, cooing sound and turned her face toward his, her dark eyes reflecting the morning sky. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the empty lot where Sarah had once planned to plant her garden. Jonathan remembered the way she had knelt in the dirt, her hands gentle as she coaxed life from the stubborn soil. She had wanted children so desperately, had prayed for them every night until her voice grew hoarse with longing. Now here was a child, born of violence and tragedy, yet innocent as the morning dew. The irony was not lost on him. God's answer to Sarah's prayers had come wrapped in the cruelest of packages. Yet as he looked down at the baby's face, he could not find it in himself to see anything but possibility. "Her name," Jonathan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. "What did they call her?" Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the other men, as if seeking permission to speak. "Asha," he said finally. "Her mother named her Asha before she died in childbirth. It means hope in some foreign tongue." The words settled over them like a benediction, and Jonathan felt something stir in his chest, not the cold rage he had carried for months, but something warmer, more dangerous. Hope was a luxury he had not allowed himself since Sarah's death, yet here it was, cradled in his arms. The townspeople began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising and falling like the sound of distant thunder. Jonathan could catch fragments of their conversations, words like madness and grief and unholy. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, shook her head so vigorously that her bonnet came loose. "It ain't natural," she declared to anyone who would listen. "A man don't raise up his enemy's child. It goes against the order of things." But Jonathan was no longer listening to their protests. He was watching Asha's face as she studied his own, her expression serious as a judge weighing evidence. There was something ancient in her gaze, something that spoke of wisdom beyond her months. As the crowd began to disperse, their footsteps heavy with disappointment and confusion, Jonathan remained standing in the dusty street with Asha in his arms. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its liquid song. The baby's eyelids grew heavy, and she nestled closer to his chest, her breathing slow and even. In that moment, Jonathan felt the last of his certainty crumble away like sand through his fingers, replaced by something far more terrifying and beautiful. The possibility that love might be stronger than the thirst for vengeance, and that sometimes the greatest act of justice was the one that looked most like mercy. The days that followed moved like molasses through winter air, thick with unspoken judgments and sideways glances that cut deeper than any blade Jonathan had ever known. Red River Valley had always been a place where secrets festered in the spaces between words. But now the silence itself seemed to breathe with disapproval. Every morning when he walked to the general store with Asha bundled against his chest, Conversations died like candle flames snuffed by wind. Women pulled their children closer, as if the baby carried some contagion of violence in her innocent blood. Men who had once shared whiskey and stories on his porch now found urgent business elsewhere when they saw him coming down the dusty main street. The baby had taken to his presence with an ease that both comforted and tormented him. She would curl her tiny fingers around his calloused thumb while he fed her milk from a bottle he'd fashioned from glass and rubber. Her dark eyes, so achingly familiar yet mercifully different, watching his face with the trust that only the very young could offer. In those quiet moments before dawn, when the world was painted in shades of grey and possibility, Jonathan found himself whispering stories to her about her mother, the woman whose name he'd never known, but whose memory he was determined to honor. He told Asha about the wildflowers that bloomed near the creek each spring, about the way morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the kitchen where Sarah used to hum while making bread, about the kind of woman he hoped she would become. But the town's memory was longer and less forgiving than his own evolving heart. Pastor Williams had visited twice, his Bible clutched like a shield against the moral complexity of Jonathan's choice, speaking in careful circles about Christian duty and the dangers of harboring the seed of evil. The pastor's wife had been more direct, her voice sharp as broken glass when she declared that some sins ran in the blood, that raising the child was like nurturing a viper that would one day turn and strike. Jonathan had listened to their words with the patience of a man who had already walked through fire and found himself still breathing, but their visits left him feeling more isolated than ever, as if he were the last man standing on an island while the tide of public opinion rose around him. The hardest moments came when he caught glimpses of what his life might have been, when Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter laughed in the street, or when he saw young families gathered for Sunday service, their children clean and bright as new pennies. Sarah should have been there beside him, should have been the one to teach Asha how to braid her hair and mend torn dresses and navigate the treacherous waters of growing up female in a world that demanded both strength and softness. Instead, there was only him. A man whose hands knew more about breaking horses than braiding hair, whose heart carried the weight of two different kinds of love, one buried beneath the cottonwood tree behind his house, the other sleeping peacefully in a cradle he'd built from scraps of oak and hope. The isolation pressed against him like a physical thing, heavy as the summer heat that shimmered off the plains and made the horizon dance with false promises. He found himself talking to Sarah's grave more often, his voice carrying across the empty fields as he tried to explain choices that felt both inevitable and impossible. Sometimes he imagined he could hear her voice in the wind that moved through the tall grass, telling him that love was never a mistake, that mercy was its own form of courage. But other times, in the deep hours of night, when Asha's cries pierced the darkness, and he stumbled to comfort her with hands that still trembled with grief, he wondered if the town was right, if he was a fool playing with forces beyond his understanding. Yet each morning when the baby smiled at him, that toothless, radiant expression that seemed to hold all the world's innocence, Jonathan felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening in a house that had been locked too long, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. 3 months had passed since the day Jonathan Miller became a father to his enemy's child, and the autumn wind carried more than the scent of dying leaves. It brought riders whose faces were carved from the same stone as their intentions. Marcus Webb had returned to Red River Valley with 2 of his brothers and a cousin whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow cast by lightning. They rode into town on a Tuesday morning when the sky hung low and grey as an old wool blanket, their horses' hooves striking the packed earth with the rhythm of a funeral drum. Word spread faster than wildfire through dry grass. The Webb family had come to reclaim what they considered theirs, and every soul in Red River Valley knew that blood would answer for blood before the sun set on another day. Jonathan was mending fence posts when young Tommy Patterson came running across the fields, his face pale as milk and his words tumbling over each other like stones down a hillside. The boy's message was simple and terrible. Marcus Webb was waiting in the saloon, and he'd made it clear that he intended to take his niece home, one way or another. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and setting his hands to trembling in a way they hadn't since the day he'd first held Asha against his chest. He looked toward the house where the baby was sleeping in her cradle, her tiny fists curled like flower buds, completely unaware that her world was about to be torn apart by men who measured love in terms of bloodline and possession. The walk into town felt longer than any journey Jonathan had ever taken, each step carrying him further from the life he'd built and closer to a confrontation that would define not just his future, but Asha's as well. The streets were emptier than usual, as if the very air had grown thick with the promise of violence, and those few souls brave enough to venture outside watched him pass with the mixture of fascination and horror reserved for men walking toward their own execution. The saloon doors stood open like the mouth of some great beast, and through them Jonathan could see Marcus Webb sitting at a corner table, his back to the wall and his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. The resemblance between Marcus and his dead brother was striking. The same sharp cheekbones, the same cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through a man's soul and find it wanting. When Jonathan stepped through those doors, the conversation died as completely as if someone had thrown a blanket over the room. Marcus Webb looked up slowly, his gaze traveling from Jonathan's boots to his face with the deliberate assessment of a man sizing up livestock at auction. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest provocation, and Jonathan could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against his shoulders like stones. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never doubted his own power. "I hear you've been playing house with something that belongs to my family, Miller. That's a mistake that needs correcting." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Jonathan felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but the crystalline clarity that came when a man realized he was standing at the crossroads between who he had been and who he was meant to become. He thought of Asha's laugh, the way she reached for him when she woke from her naps, the trust in her eyes that had slowly healed wounds he'd thought would never stop bleeding. When he spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock, carrying the weight of a decision that had been made not in this moment, but in all the moments that had led to it. "That little girl isn't property to be claimed, Webb. She's my daughter now, and I'll die before I let you take her." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence that everyone knew was coming, but Marcus Webb only smiled, a cold, predatory expression that never reached his eyes. And Jonathan realized that this confrontation was only the beginning of a war that would test everything he believed about justice, family, and the price of love. The standoff in the saloon lasted only minutes, but those minutes stretched like hours in Jonathan's memory, each second weighted with the knowledge that words spoken in anger could never be taken back, that some lines, once crossed, redrew the map of a man's entire existence. Marcus Webb had risen from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, his hand never leaving his gun, and the space between them had become charged with the electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Other patrons had melted away like snow in spring rain, leaving only the two men and the bartender who stood frozen behind his counter like a statue carved from fear. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of unfinished business and the ghosts of the dead who demanded their due. But it was not violence that ended the confrontation. It was the sound of tiny footsteps on wooden planks and a voice that cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "Mrs. Patterson had brought Usher to town, the baby riding on her hip with the easy contentment of a child who had never known anything but love and safety. The moment Usher saw Jonathan, she reached for him with both arms, babbling in the wordless language that only fathers and daughters truly understand, and the sight of her, so small and trusting, in a room full of men whose hearts were hardened by grief and rage, changed everything. Marcus Webb's face went through a series of transformations, from cold determination to something that might have been recognition, then to a pain so raw and immediate that it seemed to strip years from his features. Jonathan lifted Usher into his arms, feeling her small body relax against his chest, and in that moment he understood that this was not just about custody or blood or even justice. It was about the fundamental question of what it meant to be family, what it meant to love someone not because you had to, but because you chose to. The baby looked at Marcus with the curious, fearless gaze of the very young, and something in her expression, perhaps an echo of her father's features, perhaps simply the universal innocence of childhood, seemed to reach through all the layers of anger and grief that had armored the man's heart. Marcus's hand fell away from his gun, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the terrible recognition of his own capacity for both love and loss. The words that passed between them then were not the harsh declarations of war that everyone had expected, but something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. A negotiation between two men who had both lost everything and found themselves responsible for protecting the one thing that remained. Marcus spoke of his brother, of the man Daniel had been before grief and whiskey had twisted him into something unrecognizable, of the family that had been torn apart by violence and poor choices and the kind of pride that killed more surely than any bullet. Jonathan listened with the patience of a man who understood that some stories needed to be told, that some wounds could only heal when they were finally exposed to light and air and the possibility of forgiveness. The agreement they reached was not written down in any legal document, would not be recognized by any court or sanctioned by any church, but it carried the weight of something more binding than law. The acknowledgement that Usher belonged not to any one person, but to the love that surrounded her, that she was both Webb and Miller and something entirely her own. Marcus would visit, would be part of her life, would help Jonathan raise her with the knowledge of where she came from and who her people were. But she would stay with the man who had chosen her when the world expected him to turn away, who had seen past the circumstances of her birth to the infinite possibility that lived in her smile. As the three of them walked out of the saloon together, Jonathan carrying Usher, Marcus walking beside them with the careful steps of a man learning to navigate a new world, the people of Red River Valley watched in stunned silence, witnessing something they had never expected to see, the moment when love proved stronger than vengeance, when mercy became its own form of justice, when two broken men chose to build something beautiful from the ruins of their shared grief. The sun was setting over the plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in months, Jonathan Miller felt like he could breathe again.